This is the last tutorial you will ever need on Figma variables. We're going to look at prototyping. We're going to look at conditional logic. We're going to look at design system setup and a whole lot more. By the end of this video, you'll be able to say you're an expert on Figma variables. Let's get started. And be sure to check out UI Collective Academy for premium courses and a whole lot more. Link is in the description. Okay, welcome to the one-stop video for everything to know about Figma variables. Like, there's a ton of different tutorials. I've covered this in a ton of different tutorials in the past. We're covering absolutely everything today. By the end of this video, you can watch this full video and you can go into any interview, any room in a meeting, talk to anyone and know everything there is possibly to know about variables. Okay, this is it. I'm covering everything. So right away, we're going to start with some of the boring theory for a couple minutes before we move into Figma and the more actionable items. Is that Figma variables are not design tokens. Why not? One word, Figma. Figma variables are unique to Figma. But design tokens, they can really be anything. Let's take a closer look at that. So at a high level, when it's moved out of Figma, it's no longer a Figma variable. You know, in theory, sure, it is a Figma variable. But the second a developer takes that Figma variable and moves it into the code, it's no longer a Figma variable. That's known as like a design token in theory, okay? Design tokens can be cross-platform. Figma variables cannot. So what I mean by that is you can adjust a design token. And in theory, it would adjust colors on a PowerPoint slide, colors in Figma, colors in Microsoft Word, colors in Sketch if you still use it. That is a design token. Design tokens are meant to be super global. Again, there's no system out there, at least that I know, that does that cross-platform type change. But in design token, that's in an ideal state, that's what they are, okay? And design tokens are also unique to design elements. So what I mean, this is like radiuses. This is colors. This is type styles. Everything we're going to look at a little bit later in this. But Figma variables also covers prototyping too. So it includes everything that would be considered as a design token, but it also includes a lot of things that are not design tokens. Okay. So at a high level, now you have some background knowledge on the key difference between a Figma variable and a design token. Believe it or not, I've chatted to some designers where that was actually an interview question that was asked. Okay, promise you, that's the only basic theory we're going to cover in this video. So now let's open up Figma and dive into our variables. Here we are within our variables. Now, there's a couple. Well, let's look at sort of what all the different types of variables are. Okay, let's start off with Boolean because it's generally the more complex one, where if you're new to Figma variables or you don't have sort of like some background knowledge on development, like it's kind of where a lot of people get stuck right away. Okay, so what a Boolean variable is essentially you're toggling something on and off, but instead of on and off, that uses the word true and it also uses the word false. So think about false, something is not showing. If it's true, something is showing. Okay, that's the easiest way to look at that. Now, just a quick example. Let me move my video bar out of the way here. I'm just going to add in a quick frame, and let's just set this to maybe like a, I don't know, like a desktop size here. Okay, so say we have this desktop size. And again, Boolean variables are specific to being in prototyping. When you're in the actual design editor of Figma, they don't matter, okay? It's just something that you apply, but they only actually ever come into play when you are viewing a prototype. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add, just this bar here, okay? And I'm just going to add this quick button that just says close, okay? So let's build a quick button, close, set this to, black background, and set the text to white. Okay, so let's assume for the purposes of this exercise that we have this desktop frame here, and let's pretend we have just like some sample cards and things like that, whatever. So we have some sample cards. Maybe we have one down here as well. And we're testing, different messaging for a banner. Okay, we're testing a prototype, sharing this with our users, so users can click around. Okay, what we can actually do is by clicking this button in the prototype, we can actually hide this entire element. So I'm going to group these together here. And what we're going to do is let's go back into our variables and let's just assign this the name of, sorry, I wish I had a larger screen here. Let's just assign this the name of alert, okay? An alert banner. And let's set this to true because in the purposes of this exercise, let's pretend that when a user lands on this dashboard screen for the very first time, that alert is always showing. Maybe it's some type of FAQ, something like that. With me so far? Perfect. Okay, so now that that's set to true, we need to actually go ahead and apply it. So at the layer level here, the appearance level, where we have this hide icon, okay, on the right-hand bar, I'm going to two-finger tap on my trackpad. And again, I'm on a Mac to do this. I'm going to two-finger tap. And notice how when I do that, I can now select the Boolean variable. If I was to have color variables or anything like that, those would not be listed here. Only the Boolean variables are generally listed under the appearance, okay? So I'm going to set that to true. Beautiful. With me so far? Awesome. So now that that Boolean variable is applied, what we're going to need to do is actually use some variable prototyping in order to hide this banner using our Boolean variables when we click this button. Okay, but first, what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to add some auto layout between these and some auto layout between these, because then in an ideal world, when we hide this banner, everything that gets shifted up. Okay, that's kind of what we want in a prototype. So now what we're going to do, we're actually going to take a look at prototyping with our Boolean variables. Like, how do you set something from true to false on click to show or hide something accordingly? Okay, so we have this real sample button here. So let's click into it. Then we're going to navigate to prototype, and we're going to add an interaction. So on this click, what we are doing is we are actually setting the variable alert to false. So it's currently set to true. Therefore, this is showing. But on click, what we're actually going to do is change that to false. So if we open back up our variables where we set this to true, so it's currently set to true, so it's showing. If in my variables I was to toggle this to false, notice how it hides, okay? Let's do the same with the prototype, or show you how it works with the prototype now. So let's preview this. Preview's a little slow, or actually let's just present it just so we can see it. Okay, so let's fill the screen here. So now watch what happens when I hit this close button. When I hit this close button, the Boolean variable is going from true, because right now this banner is showing, and then it's going to go to false, meaning it is no longer showing. So I'm going to hit close, and look what happens. It is now no longer showing. Because before we had Boolean variables, what the prototyping logic would actually have to be is we would have two different screens for this, okay? Or we would sort it out in like our variants and things like that. We won't get into it. Where when this button was hit, it would have to navigate to a different frame, okay? But our Boolean variables now actually allow us to handle those types of interactions all within one frame by assigning the Boolean variable to the specific elements that need to be shown or hidden. Now, this can also work in reverse, right? But when you work in reverse and things are hidden, you kind of need to be a little bit organized in how your variables are structured, at least set up and organized into collections. I'll show you what I mean, okay? So I'm going to create a new Boolean here, and let's just call this like alert2, okay? And let's just copy this. So alert2 is going to be set to false, and then on some type of click, we're going to set it to true, okay? So in this case here, what we would do, we just detach this, because again, I just copied the frame, and we're actually going to go ahead and apply alert2. Okay, so here in this case, if I set this alert2, it's false, all of a sudden it's hidden. So unless you have like a really good documentation, or the prototyping logic within your prototype is actually communicated, a lot of designers might not actually know where like things are, because they might be hidden by a Boolean variable. Okay, so this is where like designers' lives are a little bit miserable, because when you're looking at the Figma canvas, you have no idea of knowing where things are hidden by a Boolean variable that's set to false. Okay, now it's the same thing here. So what I'm actually going to do, let's sorry, I know I say that, someone say that a lot. Someone commented, you say this is actually what we're going to do a lot, so sorry. Okay, so let's just set this alert2 to true for now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add the same logic here, where we're going to set the variable alert2 to false, false. There we go. So again, same logic. When this is closed, all of a sudden it is set to false. And then there we go. Or when it's open and this is clicked, that's then set to false. So let's go back to our variables and let's turn off alert2. So we're setting it to false. And then maybe just for this example, if we were to have like an open warning, I don't know, something like that, button at the top here. What we would do, we would then set the interaction where on click, we're setting the variable alert2 to true. Okay, so there's some level of back and forth with that. So now when we go ahead and actually play this here, if we were to present this, let me fill the screen, and we hit open warning, notice now how it shows, and when I hit close, notice now how that is hidden again. Okay, so Boolean variables, they can go back and forth. If you want something to show, you're always going to need some type of element that when clicked actually sets that Boolean variable to true. Okay, now that is Boolean variables in a nutshell. When Figma first launched Boolean variables, everyone was like, what is this? How does it work? Even now, I still get a ton of questions in our Slack channel from our academy. I get emails about Boolean variables. You have now mastered Boolean variables. Okay, there's not much more to know than that right there. Okay, so now let's jump into number variables. Now, number variables are exactly what they are. They're variables that are numbers. Okay, but you might be asking is like, what's the difference between a number variable and a string variable? I know we haven't looked at string variables just yet. We're gonna look at that soon. But just as like a teaser, string variables are unique to actually text, like things like words. They can be used for fonts. They can be used for consistency in language and changing languages and all this fun stuff. But number variables actually come to life with math. Math. This is Figma. We're designers. We don't do math. Okay, but everyone can do basic math using your number variables. And again, the whole purpose of variables was so that we didn't have like 400 different screens. So think of like an add to cart button. If I was to hit add to cart, I want to see that something was added to carts on like maybe a little counter. Think about Amazon. You add something to account, top right at your account, so you can see sort of like I have one item in my cart. I have two items in my cart. That's where number variables comes into play. Okay, so let's take a look at that same example here. So maybe like items in cart. Okay, we're gonna set this to 0 to start. Okay, so let's build out this real simple example here. Okay, and let's build out a little button, my cart, and let's set it to black, and again the text to white. Again, this isn't a beautiful UI, just to get the purpose across. My carts. And then maybe what we're going to do, we're going to add a little badge. Okay, so maybe we have 0 items in my cart for now. And then let's set this to something like a I'm a big soccer fan, so let's look for like a Chelsea blue or something like that. Okay, and set this to white. Chelsea's, their color is blue, in case you didn't know. But anyways, let's continue on. So set this to 28 by 28 and just set the radius to like 100. Okay, so we sort of have this little badge here. So I can see that. So my cart, 0 items in the cart. And let's bring this button down and say add to cart. Okay, real simple tutorial for this. So we have our variable here with a number of items in our cart, which is set to 0. But now what we need to do, we need to apply that to this value. Go ahead here. So select the text, again, not the layer that has the badge in it, but the actual text itself. And we're going to hit this button here on the top right to apply the variable. And we're going to apply items in the cart. So notice that is set to 0. Okay, so if I hit that is set to 0 because our value here is 0. If I was to set this to 2, notice how it changes to 2. Okay, so we're going to set that to 0 for now. So what we're going to do now is what we want to have happen is that when add to cart is clicked, that the number increases by 1 each time. Now, similar to how we did the Boolean variables, let's add an interaction here where on click, we're going to set the variable items in carts to items in carts plus 1. Okay. Now, let's now play this prototype. So let's play this. Let's present this. There we go. So I'm going to add to cart. And now look what happens. Notice how that number increased. Add to cart, 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 all the way. Notice how it just keeps going up. That is one of the really large use cases of number Figma variables. Because again, if we wanted our prototype to come to life, like 2 years ago, every time a user would hit add to cart, it would need to navigate to a different screen where that number would actually increase. But now, all of a sudden, we can increase that number to 100 all within the one screen. So being able to do basic math like this in prototypes is really the main purpose of number variables, because it makes our life easy. Now, one thing I'd like to highlight here is in the prototype, it's set to 24, but here back on the frame, the number did not change. Okay, that is intentional. Prototype, like the variables only change in the actual prototype. They never actually change on the design file itself. Something I'd like to call out where a lot of people get stuck first time. Now, one thing also that tends to happen that I have seen in the past is instead of items in cart to items in cart plus one, what I have seen is a lot of designers just do this, plus one. And it looks like now the Figma actually blocked designers from doing that. I know when it first came out, a lot of designers would just put items in carts to plus one. Okay. But it doesn't work like that. You actually need to always have the items in cart so that the same variable in the target and also the value. So items in cart to items in cart plus one. But there's actually different, again, we just only looked at add. You can also like add, subtract, divide, multiply. And when we get into our conditional logic a little bit later on in this video, is we're going to look at how we can like maybe also adjust like a dollar amount that's also due based on how much one of these items is worth. Anyways, sorry, let's continue on here. Okay, so we can also do other types of math associated with this as well. Okay, so let's maybe start to get this set up. Let's just bring in this button here and just remove this variable. And this is going to be, let's delete that. Maybe this is just subtract. Maybe this is, divide. Sorry, let me get off the prototype here. Divide, and then also multiply. Okay, so let's just set this up real quick. Multiply, so you can try it yourself. So what we're going to do, we're going to essentially divide, sort of showcase how we can do similar math. So subtract, divide, multiply using our variables as we did the add. Okay, so let's just add some text here. Set this to a value, and a value. And let's just go into our variables. And let's just create a number variable here for subtract, one for divide, and one for multiply. And again, quick tip that I'm using here for, again, this is more useful when you get into design systems that we're going to look at later on, is actually if you hit shift and then enter, it duplicates the last variable. So instead of having to go and select it, you can add one and just hit shift and enter. So, and it will just automatically add one. So quick trick there. So let's just delete that variable. So let's set subtract to something like 5, divide to something like 10, and multiply to something like 2. And let's just apply these values here. So the subtract, we're going to add the subtract. Notice how it sets the value to 5. This one here, this is going to be our divide. Notice how it sets the value to 10. And then this one here, we're going to go ahead and multiply. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and actually apply like the math logic using our variables. And again, this might seem like basic stuff, but it's important to really understand this concept, because this can get a whole lot more complex once we look at our conditional logic. Okay, so let's go ahead then and get started here. So let's go ahead and add a prototype here. We're add an interaction. We're on click. We're going to set the variable to subtract minus 1. Again, you can set it to 2 if you want, whatever, depending on what your math needs are. Okay, there we go. So now if I was to go ahead and I was to play this, all right, come on, refresh for me here. So if I was to play this and I hit subtract, I can see, sorry, it might be hard to see. I'll zoom in a bit. You can see it goes down. Okay, so then what we're going to do, let's move on to our divide now. So we're going to add the interaction where on click, we're going to set the variable to divide divided by 2 each time. There we go. So now if I was to hit divide, notice how it then goes down to 5. Okay, and let's do the same for multiply. Let's add the interaction. We're on click. We're going to set the variable to multiply times 2. Okay, so for that, we hit the star, and every time I hit multiply, I want to multiply it by 2. So let's flip back here, and I can see it goes up by 2 every single time. Okay, so using variables in our variable number variables we can start to, really make our prototype come to life by adjusting the numbers. This works great if you're working on heavy dashboards. The metrics on a dashboard should change based on how a user interacts with your prototype when you're doing user testing, things like that. But this is just covering it at a high level. There's actually, we can get into some more complex elements here with our number variables, which involves conditional logic. So I want to take a look at that. So I changed my mind. Let's just get rid of this. So before we actually go ahead and start looking at our conditional logic, one thing I also want to cover is the idea of being able to almost like layer your variable interactions. Okay, so let's look at what I mean by that. So what I mean by this is that let's just have a price up here and set this to like $10. Okay, so 10. There we go. So number variable. And what we're going to do is let me connect this. And let's just add a $sign here to the other side. Add some auto layout here real quick and just set both of these to hug and hug just so they appear side by side. Sorry, me getting picky. Okay. So we have our number variable. Then we have a $sign here. So let's add in a quick price. Okay. So let's add in a number variable here for our price, our total price, total value, whatever. I'm going to set this to 0. Okay. So let's go ahead. Let's apply this element here, and we're going to set that total value to 0. Okay. So now we have add to cart, and every time something is added to cart, we might want that price to increase by 10. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll hit this button here and adjust this value. So this interaction. So we already have one action here. Let's add another. So set the variable so when this is clicked, what's happening is we're increasing the cart value by 1, but we also want to increase the dollar value of the total cart. So we're increase the dollar value by 10 each time. Okay. So total value to total value plus 10. So notice how we can now start to it's not quite conditional logic. We can start, again, you can do it with conditional logic, but this is just another workaround, right? Where if this happens, this happens. So let's go ahead and present this now. So remember what's going to happen. So we have two interactions. One where when this button is hit, the cart value increases. And also the dollar value increases. So let's say whatever this add to cart button item is associated with is $10. Okay. So I'm going to add to cart, add to cart, add to cart. Notice how by clicking the one button, all of a sudden we have multiple interactions that are associated with it. And if I extend this out, so on click, the items in cart is increasing by 1, and also the total value is also increasing by 1. Now, in this example, one thing you might go look back and check is notice how I separated the dollar value and also the number value itself. If you were to do this in this case, the number value needs to be separate from the $sign, because of course that's not a number. Okay, you can't even enter it in there anyway. So again, sometimes you might need to separate out numbers from actually text when you're doing it in this way. Okay, so again, when you're prototyping with your variables, again, it's totally fine and makes life easier to actually layer in additional set variable interactions within one button click itself. So real quick here, I know I mentioned I'd touch upon some conditional logic next, but one thing I want to do here is I'm going to get through all of the variables first, then we're going to merge them together to show how you can use conditional logic to sort of merge a lot of the interactions that we're going to build together into a little bit more of a complex structure. Okay, so we'll go through all the rest of the variables, cover some of the more finer items, and then we'll loop back to conditional logic. So now let's look at string variables, that are also known as text variables. Now, they're technically called string variables because they have a T here and they involve text. Everyone assumes, you see the T in the icon, everyone assumes that, they have to do with your font, right? So your font size, your line height. Absolutely not the case. Okay, so there's a common misconception. Even I'm bad at it. I always call my string variables my text variables, even though they don't necessarily always go into my type styles. Anyways, we're going to look at that when we get into Figma variables in design systems a little bit later. Okay, because what most people, again, they assume is that this is where you put your font size, but when we get there, you're going to realize that this is not actually the case. Okay, but what your string variables are for are for things like labels, changing between languages, which we can look at when we get into modes and all the different use cases. Okay. But the easiest way to think about string variables is assigning specific words to words. Okay. Now let me delete this here because font size is not what we're rocking with. And let's go ahead and let's add a page size. So let's add a desktop, and let's simply just add, an add to cart button. So add to cart. Let's go ahead, add some auto layouts, set this to fill. There we go. And then what we can do is just change this as such. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's create a string variable that we're going to call just our button, and then set the value to what we want the text to be. Okay. So in this case, add to cart. Now, we can add a second string variable for what we want it to change to. So maybe if this is like a disabled button, I don't know. And again, we're going to look at how we can swap variants using our string variables a little bit later on. Okay. And then when the button is disabled or none left, none left. Okay. So in this case, we're going to add something to the cart, but then the button says like, oh, none are left. You can't actually add any more to your cart. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to, again, similar to how we assign the number variable, up here at the top under text, we're going to apply the variable add to cart. Then we can prototype this. So we can add an interaction that is going to set the variable button to none left. Then what we can do is if we delete this, and let's play this from the beginning. So when I hit add to cart, notice how the text value changes with it. Okay. That's a string variable. Now, one thing I would like to cover with string variables is you're going to notice, and it's something that's bothered me in the past, is a lot of designers, they always assume that for every value, they need a variable for it. But depending on the complexity of your prototype and the complexity of your designs, you don't want to have like 5,000 different string variables. So if I was to do delete this variable here and go into our actual interaction, what we can do is we can get rid of this and actually change it to just plain text here. So none left, none left. So assigning what's called like a string literal. So even though I deleted that variable and I was to delete this and reset this from the beginning, and I hit add to cart, the text there still changes. Okay. So you don't always need a string variable for every single string that you want to change it to. You can assign what is called a string literal. So you don't need the variable for it. You can just enter in what you want that text to change to itself. So the value of string variables is usually something where designers are like, what? Like, what's the purpose of this? But you got to think outside the box. Okay. When we get into modes, you got to think that languages, you could swap language modes, right? String variables would therefore apply to this. But one of like a common thing that you can think about is just like how you want to change labels and things between pages. Now, I actually went through this exact use case where I was going through user research testing with a bunch of different users, and instead of the name on every single one of the prototypes that the users were viewing was Kirk, right? Like my name. Like what I would do is be like, hey Steve, or sorry, it'd be like, hey, let me go. It'd be like, hey, and then here we'd have Steve. So it'd be, hey, let's add some auto layout between these. And then I would hug this. There we go. And hug. Sorry. Me being picky. I know. Set this to something like 12. And then what I would do is that I would actually have like add a string variable where it's like username, where it would be like Steve. So on the dashboard, it would say Steve, and across like all these different cards and widgets that the user was clicking through, it would have like different names. So on the settings, maybe it was Steve was also there. So if this was your settings, this was settings, that you might have a form field with Steve inside of it, right? So again, things that just make it come to life a bit. So you might have first name, right? First name field. So this is like sort of an edge example, but it's an example that's actually served me a purpose when I was actually doing user testing, is instead of having to go through and always change the person's name, I just enter in here and just be like, oops, I forgot to apply the specific name. the variable here. I could go in here and just say change it to Kirk, and notice how the text on both the dashboard and the settings pages adjusted with it based on the name of the user who was actually testing the prototype. So again, the value of string variables is not always like apparently clear, okay? But it's one of those things, they come in handy when you need them to come in handy. Now, one thing I do want to cover, which is hands down the most important part of string variables, is the ability to swap variants using your string variables. And this has saved me so much time. It is a little bit complex, but let's take a look at it. So now let's look at swapping our variants using our variables. So let's maybe go just like, let's create a simple button component, add to cart, okay? And then let's go ahead and let's add some auto layout here, add a quick fill, and we're gonna set this to, I don't know, like whatever color this is here, and set the text to white. Again, we're just building a really simple button component, okay? Or add to card, not add to card. Let's call this our button, create the component. There we go. And now we're gonna go ahead and add a variant here. So say like, again, we have a videos where you build design system components, but just say this is like your status, sorry, not your type. Again, I'll put a link to our build a design system series down below in case you were curious. This is here is our default, and then this here is our disabled, okay? So for disabled, let's just simply make it, I don't know, gray, add a border stroke, light gray, and then set this text to dark gray. I don't know, some like simple disabled color here, okay? With me so far? Let's then go into our variables. And let's create some variables here. So string variables in this case, and let's just call this our button default. Set this to our default value, and then set this to our button disabled, and set this to our disabled value. Okay. Now, one thing, so let's maybe just move that video bar out of the way. Let's maybe just put this in a desktop frame here just to visualize it. And again, this is probably a little bit too big. Whatever, we'll keep it as is. And we'll just set this text to a little bit of a larger size. Sorry, me being picky. I just want to make sure the button, you guys can actually see it on the prototype. Okay, so let me pull this in here. Okay, and let's make it even just a little bit wider. Sorry, I just want to make sure you guys see it. Forgive me. Set this to like 18 and 16, something like that. It's a little bit of a bigger button, and let's just set this to like an enter semi-bold. Okay, there we go. So we have our default, and then we have our disabled here. Now, in order for us to prototype with the string variables, is what's one thing that we're missing here is we need to be able to assign the string variables that we created to this variant. Okay, not on the main component itself, but the actual variant. So to do this, we add the variant, we select the variant, and then come up here to like our variant section, and notice now how we have the little variable icon. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the variable, and I am going to apply the button default. Now, look what happens when I do that. Notice how it appears normal, like button default. It's connected. Okay, watch what happens if I was to change this to something else. Sorry, oops. There we go. So button default. Then if I was to change this to default 1, look what happens then. Is it gets crossed out. It's because the variable value doesn't match to a variant name. So the value of your strings needs to match the name of your variants. Because if we come back here and I change this back to default, notice how it recorrects itself. And it's because our variants are default and then disabled. With me so far? Perfect. So now what we can do is on prototype, we can add an interaction that's going to set the variable button default to button disabled. Okay, so now it's going to be swapping the variants. And this is particularly useful when you're working with like, disabled buttons and things like that. And we're gonna look at conditional logic when to bake it into like a little bit of a larger experience very shortly. So now when I hit add to cart, notice how it therefore becomes disabled. Okay, so we are swapping the variants using our string variables. Now there's a whole lot of things that you can do with this. You can build image carousels, like There's a whole bunch of other things. I actually think a couple years ago when variables first came out, I released a video on actually building like an image carousel using this logic. But there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this particular approach to string variables. So now that we have that out of the way, this is like a really great time to look at like our conditional logic. Okay, so I'm going to copy this button that we have here. We're going to go back to the number prototype that we had before and really just paste this in here. Okay, I need to refresh my memory on some of the logic that we had here. Sorry, prototype. So what we did before, just refresh my memory. So we have the items in cart. When clicked is increasing the cart value and also set the total value to 10. Okay. So what we're going to do is let's just delete that and let's delete this as well. So we're basically just going to start fresh here. Okay. So let's add an interaction, just recreate the functionality that we had there before. Okay. So on click, what we are going to be doing, we're going to be setting the variable items and carts to items and carts +1. Also, what we're going to be doing is setting the variable to, set the variable to, where was it? It was our total value to total value +10. So now we have exactly what we had before, okay, just on this. Let's always be sure to test as we go here. So let's present this. So add to cart, and I can see it works as intended. But now let's say in this case, maybe we can't almost add more than 5 to the cart. Okay, so when we add more than 5 to the cart, what we actually want is we actually want the button to then become disabled, and then maybe a message appear that actually says that, hey, unable to add any more to the cart. So now let's look at how to do that using some conditional logic. So the easiest way to look at conditional logic, I just put together just this diagram here, is the current state of your prototype or your variables or whatever. Again, there's a whole bunch of things that can go into this. Is either going to end up in outcome A or it's going to end up in outcome B. So it's going to end up in A or else it is going to end up in outcome B. Now it's the conditional logic that's actually going to help define which route it's going to take. Okay, it's either outcome A or it's going to be outcome B. It's conditional logic that actually helps define that. Okay, because again, there's a condition to the logic that helps produce the end results. Now, this is what conditional logic is in like a 50,000 foot view. Okay, now let's go back into the prototyping view now that you have that intro where we can actually start to implement some of this. Okay, so let's go into our prototyping logic here. And what essentially we're going to be doing is just hit the plus and then add a conditional here. Okay, so not set variable, but add a conditional. And we'll get into the order of things a little bit later on, but anyways, we're going to continue on for now. So basically, again, sort of the example that we have here is in this case, maybe there's only 5 that can be added to the cart. Okay, so in this case, when the total value, again, thinking back to the number of variables that we created a little bit early on, when that total value is equal to, greater than, or equal to, so in this case, if it's greater than or equal to 5, okay, again, you could probably just put equal to, but we'll put greater than or equal to for now, is equal to 5. What we want to have happen is we want this button to therefore become disabled. Okay, so we're then going to set the variable, in this case, button defaults, to our button disabled. So what this is saying is that when the total, or sorry, this should be total value actually. Forgive me. This should actually be our items and carts. Thanks for calling me out behind the scenes. So when our items and cart is greater than or equal to 5, our button default is going to be set to our button disabled. Let's take a look at this in real time. Let's present. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice how all of a sudden, using our variables in the conditional logic that we set, that button now becomes disabled. It's switched to our disabled variant because we had the string variable applied, and this value is now equal to 5. Now, what's one thing that we notice here too is even though it's disabled, I can still keep clicking it. It is going to keep going up. And now we need to like play around with that logic in order to fit a lot of these different edge cases. So now let's open back up our prototype here. And what we're also going to do is let's add another variable here where in this case, so if the items in cart is greater than or equal to 5, what we're going to do is we're going to set the button default to the button disabled as we saw. But then we also might want to, in this case, set the variable items in cart simply to 5. Okay, so basically what this is going to do, we're introducing a variable where, let me just show you, okay? Words are tough today, sorry. Let me just show you. Where if I was to present this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice how it said 5? And even when I keep hitting that, notice how the value goes up for the total value. But no matter what happens, is the number of items in cart is always going to be 5. Okay. And that's where, like, using your conditional logic, you can start to introduce some of these other variables. Sorry, not variables, but like prototyping variable interactions to achieve the desired use case that you're going for. Okay, so now let's also like get fancy with things. Okay, so let's maybe add in another, let's go back to our first collection, whatever it is, where we had our Boolean variables. Sorry, let's rename this to Booleans. Booleans, there we go. And then maybe this, we're going to create a Boolean for just like items remaining. Okay, so let's add some text here where there's items remaining. There are no items remaining. Okay, there are no items remaining. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to just set this to essentially where's our Boolean? Oh, sorry, I did it the wrong place. Sorry, items remaining, set that to false for now. And then if we go back into our prototyping logic, is we can also add another interaction here. Okay, we're going to set the variable, in this case, items remaining, to true once all these things happen. Okay, so items remaining to true. So again, if I was to preview this all of a sudden, sorry, let me reset. Oops, I just did that. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then there are no items remaining. Okay, so now you can see how everything that we've done thus far, everything kind of like starts to tie together, from our Boolean variables to our string variables to our number variables, everything like that. Okay, so again, there's a whole lot that you can do with your prototyping variables, specifically with conditional logic. And one thing I want to mention here is that Figma is like iffy enough where the actual order of interactions inside your prototype really matters. Okay, so oftentimes what I've found, and again, there's no right way to do, there's no like guide on what should come first, what should come second. So when I do consulting with a lot of different design teams, a lot of different designers, whether it's in a one-time session or whatever, oftentimes what I find is they usually bring me these really complex interactions and they say, Kirk, it's not working. And I'll go through and I'll be like, yeah, that works. Yeah, that works. Yeah, that should work. Why is this not working? And then what I'll start doing is I'll actually start dragging a lot, like changing the order of some of these items. Maybe I bring this down here. Maybe I bring my whole conditional logic section down. Okay, maybe I move one variable up or down. And then usually what that does is it works. Okay, Figma is not great with giving you any errors if something's not working and why. It's kind of left up to you to figure it out. Okay, so if you think something should be working and you've tested your prototype as you're going along, and then all of a sudden it just stops working once you add a variable interaction, try changing the order of your variables inside your interaction logic, and usually you'll be able to come up with a solution that way as to why it's not working. Now let's look at colors. Now I know what you're thinking is, Kirk, it's super easy to create a color variable. Just create this as blue, change the logic here, the value, to some sort of blue color, and then simply apply the variable. So why even need to go over this? This is a great segue into modes, and this is a great segue into design system setup using your variables. Because believe it or not, out of all of the variable types, colors are hands down the easiest to use, but the most complex to set up. There needs to be a method to the madness, okay? So we all know how to apply a variable and how to apply a color variable. I just did it. But This is also a really great segue into modes. So let's take a look at modes in the context of colors, then sort of work our way back as to some other use cases that we might want to use those modes for. So modes in the context of colors. And again, we're going to look at the proper way to do this when we get into the later half of this video, when we talk about design system setup using our variables. But what modes allow us to do when it comes to colors are set values for light mode and dark mode. So if this here was a light mode color, what we can do, hit that plus, add a second mode for a dark mode color. And I don't know what Figma's logic is with paid plans and stuff like that. So if you don't have this functionality, it might be because you're on a free version. I don't know for sure. But anyways, let's condense this in so we can make this a little bit smaller. So light and dark mode are the easiest thing to look at in terms of the purpose of modes. Okay, because actually what it allows us to do here is if we set this dark mode to like a little bit of a lighter shade, something like that. And let's also maybe just add, just to visualize it a little bit better, like a surface color. So on light mode, of course, it's white. Then on dark mode, it might be black. What we can actually do is select sort of the element or sort of the page, parent, whatever it is, and then hit this little mode thing here, icon, and then change it from dark mode. Oops, I didn't apply the surface color. There we go. And you can easily swap between light mode and dark mode. Okay, it's the real purpose of modes. It's the easiest thing to think about now, but believe me, it gets way more complex. Also, too, at the same time, this could also be like brand A, and this could be brand B. Okay, so maybe you have like similar brands inside of like your design system or your app designs, things like that. They can also be brand A, brand B. And later in this video, we're going to look at if you have a light mode and dark mode, both brand A and brand B, like what that setup is like. Okay, so that's the easiest way to look at modes, okay, and colors as a whole. Pivoting away from colors for a sec on the concept of modes, we can also look at our string variables here as sort of different languages that you might need to toggle from. Maybe this is English, and here in Canada, we also have French as an official language. If you didn't know this, we have an entire province that speaks only French, really. So every app needs to be in English and also have an option for French. It's like mandatory by law. So you might have one word, like when you're setting up your prototype, one thing you might actually do is have all the words in English and then have all the words in French as another variable, and then simply just swap the mode. So instead of having to update all of the words on your prototype, you can do it in your variables and easily swap between English and French, okay? Because so then you're not working between two disjointed prototypes. You're still working within one design. All the wording's just going to change, okay? That's another good use of modes. And then still within number variables, it can also be for things like responsive collections, so which we're going to look at a little bit later, where you might have, a desktop, and then you might have a mobile. So let me just create a new variable here just so you can give you a visual. It's like the use case of this. So maybe this is like page width, maybe this is like 1440, and then maybe this is 440, whatever. So you can actually go ahead here, and if I add a frame, frame, let's apply the width here to the page width of 440. And then if I was to go ahead and set this to like our mobile, notice how that frame width collapses. And if you set up your design right, everything inside of it will collapse as well. So it's really handy for like responsive design. Okay, so that really covers color variables and also like the purpose of modes, how to add modes and things like that. So that basically covers a whole lot of that out of the way. Okay, a whole lot of the basic intros to variables out of the way. Now what we might want to start looking into is actually being able to set up our variables properly for things like prototyping and also for our design systems. I promise you, if you can set up a design system using your variables, you already have a foot into like most design roles out there, because that's actually what a lot of hiring managers and people interviewing are actually looking for. Like, do you have some fundamental design system knowledge? So trust me, it might get a little bit boring, but the next section, super important. Okay, so let's look at design system setup using our variables. This is hands down probably the more complex thing that you'll ever do when working with variables, okay? Even if you're not building out a design system at your day job, this is still a great topic to know a little bit about, okay? Now, if you're new at UI Collective, you might be wondering, like, what are your credentials in order to do this? I actually build design systems for a living. It's what like we do. We just design the systems, really. You're going to see like different approaches to this. But one thing you need to take into consideration is that not everyone builds design systems for a living. And I think that UI Clef is in a pretty unique spot where like the methods that we use are like tried and tested. And even now, sometimes what I do see there's a lot of spins on our logic, but they're not always thinking about specific use cases. Okay. So one thing I want to preface that there's a lot of different approaches out there. I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. Everyone sort of has their own unique approach to doing things. But that's just how we do things when we're working with our design system clients. Okay. Now, one thing I would like to cover is we're using a 3-tiered approach to our Figma variables, or what you might know as a design token architecture. You're going to see a lot of design systems out there that really only have like a 2-tiered approach. Okay. But 3-tiered approach is how we do things. Okay. So start a preface with that. So basically what I have here are just some basic scales. And honestly, I might even just simplify it. Maybe we'll just get rid of the yellow, so we don't need to do that. Okay. So think about UI Collective. We sort of have our core colors like this purple. We might have a secondary color, a red for error, a green for success, a gray for neutral, orange for warning, and a blue for information. Okay. These are sort of the standard scales that you would need whenever you're building out any type of design system. Okay. Again, you might have more complex colors or more colors you might not like, but no matter what, you're always going to usually have a primary. You're going to have an error, success, neutral, warning, information. So if you want to follow along, we'll go through this together, but you also add in your own scales and follow along with me sort of as I do things. Okay. And another thing that I've done here is I've actually just started fresh in our variables. It's going to make things easier. So I deleted all the variables that we had before. But anyways, with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. So the first collection, okay, that we're going to have here is actually called our brand collection. Now, our brand collection is basically every single one of our variables, at least for color and for type and numbers in their purest form. Okay. They don't have a specific role assigned to them at all. Okay. So we don't know in this collection if we're using them for a surface or for a border or for text. It's really just hex codes in their purest form. Okay. So let's look at a quick example of this. So we might have our purple, okay, purple, and then what's the word I'm looking for? Like 100. Okay, so it's just purple 100. And if you're not familiar with like the 100 scale approach, is when you're building out your color scales, there's always like logic that goes like in it. Okay, so like assuming you built out your color scales using a plugin, there's like math behind it. Okay, so basically whatever that first initial color scale is, you can assign like a 100 value or like a 200 value. So this here would be our 200. And what this does is it gives us some flexibility. Is if we need a color in between these, that would then be like a 150. Okay, so it's just sort of a way of getting the initial like naming convention down to keep our colors nice and organized. So I'm just going to delete that variable. Again, if you have any questions on that, just ask them below. I know I've covered it in a bunch of videos already. So then we might have our 300. We might have our 300. We might have our 400. Our 400. We're going to have our 500. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to have our 600. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we're going to have our 700. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we're gonna have an 800. Okay, so this is really what we're doing in the brand collection for everything. Okay, so then we're gonna have our 800 right there. That's really all it really is about. Okay, in your brand collection. Again, we don't know what this purple is used for. We don't know yet that it's our primary color. We're just giving it the role of purple. Okay, and this is like getting into some more advanced tokenography, things like that. So if I was to duplicate this group, then we might have a pink. This might be used for something like a secondary, and we can basically just like go down the line and just swap them out. 300, 400, 500, 500, or 600. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, our 700, and then our 800. Okay. And then we can duplicate this. And then this here, we're going to go with our red. Same process all the way down the line. Sorry, I know this is slow, but if you're new here and you want to follow along, I'm making sure we go through it together. So you can actually slow down the video just using YouTube's settings and, copy everything that we're doing. Oops, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I got this one wrong. There we go. 600, 700, and then our 800. And this is the most tedious part of it, but it's important to have this foundation. So if you go into an interview in your job, you need to work with a design system, you have this fundamental foundation. Okay, so I know it's tedious, and if you've already seen this part before or you want to skip ahead, you can do that below. So then we're assigning our 200, our 300 for our greens, 400, 500, 500, or 800, and just work our way down. Then our 600. There we go. So we have our greens. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to go with our grays. So our gray. Now, this setup as well that we're going to go through is a little bit more of a simple setup in terms of our Figma variables and design tokens. I'll also put a link for a video down below if you are curious about really want to take this to the next level, where I cover how to build a library a little bit more in depth in the grand scheme of things. So be sure to check out that below. There we go. So we have our grays. We're going to go lastly with our orange and then our information. So we're almost there. So I know we're about 5 minutes into this part of the video already, but it's good to have the foundation. Just color match. And then lastly, we're going to be with our blues that we're going to use for our information. And if you do also want to build like a full design system, we do have a free video on that, and I'll put the link also for that below. Or if you want to take that to the next level, the courses on our academy are a little bit more in depth. So we're almost there. Perfect. So now that we have our brand colors out of the way, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at bringing this into the next collection. And once we get all of our colors down, then we're going to focus on things like our type and how those fit into our variables now that we have a fundamental understanding of our string logic. Okay. So again, your brand collection is really just all of your hex codes in their purest form. They don't have a role yet. We don't know what they're going to be used for. Just purples, pinks, reds, greens, nothing like surface, nothing that we're naming border, anything like that. We're separating it out. Okay, so the next collection that we're going to look at is actually what we call the Alias collection. So what the Alias collection is actually doing is it's assigning those basic color scales that we had in the brand collection a specific role. Not a role in terms of like primary or in terms or not in terms of like a surface color or a border color, but in terms of, okay, what scale is your primary? What scale is your air? Okay. So let's look at an example of this. So I'm going to have primary 100 and we're just going to go, I think we had 8 colors here. So 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, and then 800. What I'm then going to be doing, because if we're UI collective, our primary color is this purple. So we're going to create the alias of this and connect it back to the brand color, to the purple in the brand collection. So the exact same. It's pretty duplicative, but there's a good reason why we do this. So our 300, our purple 400, 400, purple 500, purple 600, purple 700, or purple 800. Okay, so we just took what was our purple scale in our brand, and now we're saying like what this scale is actually going to be used for. So like a primary color, same thing. Let's duplicate this for our secondary in this case, and then maybe for secondary it's the pink. So we would connect it back to the pink. And let's focus on the, what's our next color here? Red. Perfect. Okay. So we have our primary, secondary. Now what we're going to be doing is actually, again, we can duplicate this. Now we're assigning the red the role of air. So it's no longer red. We're going to be saying this red scale here is going to be our air color itself. So our red 300, red 400, red 500, red 600, red 700, and then red 800. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why I love having the alias collection, besides keeping things organized, is what happens if, think of like your Coca-Cola. Okay. So Coca-Cola and the air colors for Coca-Cola might actually share the same color scale. So then in this case, we would have like a primary, let's just say primary example. Your primary color would be red, but then an air would also be red. And you might be wondering, like, why the duplicate? Because when we get into our next collection here, we might actually need to like tweak some of the colors in here within the primary or within the air to achieve the look that we're going for in our components. Okay. So we're basically just separating, giving each of these scales a specific role. So let's delete that group. Let's keep moving down the line. Next, we're going to have a neutral for our grays. Make sure I didn't miss one over here. Oops, I did. So let's maybe go with our success. Sorry. So our greens are going to be our success. Our green 400, our green 500, our green 600, our green 700, and then our green 800. Okay. So there's our success. Let's then duplicate this for our what we call a neutral color. So neutral is a funny one because our grays are generally used for things like our text. Okay. Our text colors and things like that. So it's going to be a neutral 100, neutral 200, neutral 300 will be our gray, neutral 400, neutral 500, 600, 700, and then our 800. There we go, just like that. And then we can duplicate this for our warning, which is going to be our orange. 100, 200, 300, 400, our 500, our 600, our 700, and then our 800. And then we can do one more for our information, which is generally like a blue. So we go connect this back to the blue, to the blue, to the blue, to the blue, 500, 600, 700, and then our 800. Now, that's basically the alias in a nutshell. Now, you might be wondering, like, especially if you're familiar with design systems already, is why not just have like where does another brand go? Like, what's the real purpose of this collection? And besides like segmenting it out, another good purpose of the alias collection is actually where you're going to house additional brands if you have them. So we're already familiar with modes by now. So it can be brand A and brand B. So in brand B, in this case, what might actually end up happening is you connect back to that pink instead of that purple. Okay. So what it will allow us to do when we actually have like the next collection all built out is we'll be able to toggle between light and dark mode, but then also toggle between the specific brands as well. And for this one, I'm actually going to go down the line here so we can visualize it a little bit later. 500, 600, our 700, and then our 800. Okay, so we can visualize how we might swap brands and also swap light and dark mode as well. Now, that's setting up your alias collection. There's a little bit more that's going to go into it when we get into things like our type, our border width, and our border radius. We're not going to worry about that right now. Okay, we're going to focus on colors. So a good way of like visualizing things here is, let me unhide this group. There we go. So you can kind of look at like, and I love this tree example. You've probably seen me use it before, where you can look at the different collections for your variables as kind of like a tree. So your brand collection are the roots of the tree. It sort of houses all those hex codes that we saw in their purest form a little bit later on, and ignore things like enter and semi-bold and 25. We'll get to that a little bit later. And then the tree trunk sort of connects your roots. So those core design tokens or Figma variables to the next collection, which is where we're going to branch off into all these specific roles for components, things like surfaces and borders, which are going to be the leaves, okay? So your alias collection is kind of like a tree trunk connecting the two collections together. That's just at least a way to look at it, okay? So without further ado then, let's look at our last collection, which is our mapped collection, which touches upon things like text, icon, surface, and border colors. Okay, so one thing I'd like to preface, I know we covered it briefly before, is what we're going to be looking at is like a really simple way of doing this, okay, within your mapped collection. This can sprout into all like different types of things depending on your brand and your use case and things like that. But if you do want to see a more complex way to set up your variables, especially your mapped collection, which covers way more use cases, I'll link a video in the description that covers that setup process. Okay, but this here is a real like introductory way to set up your design system for those like just getting started with this. Okay, so my suggestion, master this concept, understand why we're doing things, and then switch over to that video afterwards. Okay, so we're going to create a new collection, which is our mapped collection. So as I sort of prefaced with this visual here, is your mapped collection gets into things like text, icons, surfaces, and borders. Now, one thing I'd like to cover is this is not going to be specific to just buttons or just links. That's what you call a component specific token. We want to avoid those at all costs, because when you get into more complex design systems, you might have like 100 components. You don't want to have 100 groupings of variables. You want them to be general, okay, to maintain consistency. If you have different groups for buttons, links, menus, you're going to have 4 million different variables floating around, and it's going to be a nightmare to work with, okay? So we're going to keep things nice and simple. So let's start off by creating our groupings here, okay? So maybe we're going to have a surface grouping, surface. Actually, before we do that, let's maybe just go one at a time just so I don't confuse you. So we're going to start off with our surface colors. So when it comes to your surface colors, is you're always going to want a surface page, okay? What's the color that you're going to want for your page? Now, one thing I realized we didn't do is we didn't add a foundation grouping here inside your brand collection for things like your white and also your black, okay? You can put them inside your gray if you want to. I always like to, what I started doing now is sort of having like a separate grouping for foundations with our whites and then also our black. And then what you can do in your alias, you can really put it wherever. Maybe you might just want to stick it to your neutral. So maybe like a white. Foundations, come on, foundations white. And you might also have like a black as well. It doesn't really matter where you put these, okay? So now we have those made that we can use inside our actual mapped collection, okay? So again, if you're confused about what the mapped collection is, we'll build a sample component so you can see how everything like pieces together. So we're going to create the alias of this and connect it back to the alias collection, okay? Remember, thinking back to our diagram, our mapped collection is going to connect back to the tree trunk, okay, to our alias. So in this case, we're going to create the alias and look for our neutral, white in this case, okay? So what this is here, this is really the variable that's going to go on like a page. So say you have like a mobile screen here, you're going to apply the surface page to that, okay? It's really that simple. Now, what I always then do also is I also have like a surface primary. So in this case, what it is, I usually connect back to sort of like the lightest neutral, because this is for something like a card. So surface primary, this can be for something like a dashboard. If your cards have a really particular sort of subtle shade of gray, that's generally a surface primary. You can also add a surface secondary if you want to, but I tend not to get into that, at least like at this level of complexity, okay? So really that simple. Then what we're going to do is then introduce a surface action. Excuse me, sorry, I'm getting a little sick. And what this surface action is generally what color is your button going to be. So in this case, like a primary 500, again, connecting it back to the alias, the primary scale inside our alias. So if I was to build out an actual button here and say, learn more, you know, add some auto layout, add a fill, this here is going to be our surface action. And again, in the other design system video, I get into like a more complex way to structure your tokens to support multiple different kinds of buttons. But because it's a more introductory video, we're not going to get into that right now. Again, I'll put a link in the description where if you want to learn more or take this to the next level and really impress a hiring manager or a boss, you can do that. Okay. So we're going to have our surface action for a color like our button. But then we also need a hover button. So if this button was going to be hovered, and usually I make it a little bit darker. Okay. So here, if this is our button, we're going to go ahead, create the component. We can add a variance. And then this here would be our hover. So we might have our surface defaults, our defaults, and then this here is going to be our hover variance. Okay. Notice how everything's coming together a little bit. Now, you can also introduce a lighter shade of your hover if you want to, where you might have an action hover, 2, where this is a little bit lighter. You can do that. But again, in the other video that I always talked about, we get into more like complex variable structures that will support much more different shades. Okay, so be sure to check that out if you want to learn a little bit more. So we have sort of the colors for our pages. We have our sort of our core brand button. Okay. And if you did have like a secondary button, you could duplicate these and sort of have like an action, secondary if you wanted to, action hover secondary. But we're going to leave that out for now. Okay, so we have sort of the initial variables going, but now what about all the other great colors that we have here for things like our error, success, warning, information? So we can actually introduce surface colors for each of those as well. So we might have a surface success, a surface error, a surface warning, and a surface information. And these are for more like, think of like alerts. Like you have a success that is in an alert state. What's that background color going to be? Where we connect it back, in this case, maybe to the layer success. But again, it depends on your individual brand. We're going to have our warning and then also our information. Okay, then generally the last surface color that you might want to introduce is a disabled, for like a disabled button where we can connect back to like a neutral 200, whatever. Okay, so in terms of sort of your surface colors, this is always a great way to start. Okay, when you really want to master your variables. Now, one thing I'd also like to cover is maybe we also want just to call this our light for now, and we're going to look at how to create a dark mode as well. Okay, so now that we have some of our surface colors out of the way, let's look at our text, our icon, and also our border. Okay, so one thing I would also like to cover here is I call this primary, but you can also call this default if you want to represent sort of like the default color, just because we already have a primary scale. Sometimes the word primary, it can get a little bit confusing, okay? So when it comes to your surface, what you can usually do just to save time is actually just duplicate this for your border, okay? And then we're gonna remove our border page because it's pretty unlikely that you would have some type of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Border on your page, okay? Pretty unlikely. So we're going to remove that for now. But now our border default would be basically whatever, I would think of like the card or standard card design that we would have on like a dashboard. This would be the stroke for this, okay? So this would be our border default, because we also have our surface default here as well. Our border action and action hover, same thing, okay? What's the border that would go onto sort of that default button? So a stroke, which would be a border action, and you might have a border, a border action hover. Okay, and then for things like success, error, warning, information, disabled, like it's really the same things that apply. But for this, you might want a little bit of separation between them. So maybe your border is a little bit darker. Okay, just as an example. Okay, they don't always need to be exactly the same. Really that easy. And then a border disabled if you want to as well. Now, if you go watch some of our other tutorials for a border, one thing we do actually need is a border focus, which will be a primary 500 in this case. So I always like to have the same as the action. So I would go actually watch our build a design system video. Okay, it's a free 3-hour-long video here on YouTube. I'll put the link for that down below as well, where it goes into the purpose of a focus state. But I always have a focus border inside of my mapped collection. Okay, so now you can see how everything is really like coming together, where we've started to apply some of our variables here to some sample components and talk about some of the use cases of our surface and our borders. But now separate and a little bit more challenging, they're not challenging, but different, are things like our text and also our icon colors. Okay, so now let's create a new grouping here for our text colors, starting with like our text headings. Okay, so for this, what we're going to do is we're going to go back and connect it back to like a neutral dark, and we might as well also have a text body color. Okay, so text headings, text body, and maybe it's a little bit lighter. Okay, if you want to, you can also have things like a text placeholder, text caption, things like that. And this is really where this year would go. So maybe this is a 400, and maybe this is a 500. Okay, if you really wanted to get into that. Now what we're going to need to do is actually introduce a text action and also a text action hover. Now, where this is different from your buttons is that your text action is actually, let's connect this back to our primary, or then our primary, is that what this is for is actually for like a link component because it's specific to text. So say if you have a paragraph and you have like a hyperlink where it's like learn more or something, or like a click here to, or what's a good example? Like whatever, like click here to learn more inside of a paragraph. So it's not actually a button. Okay. This would actually go on to like a link component. So if this was a link, what you can do is you can, add some auto layout if you wanted to, change this to like a text action. Oops. Text action. Okay. It would be the color for like your link component. Okay. That's really like the purpose of that itself. Okay, still moving down is we're also gonna have a text success, a text, information, text error, text warning. And what these are here, these are just like any success color. So if you think you have a success alert and the text is green, being like, hey, success, like this process was successfully completed, what's that color? Okay. Try to be consistent with your casing. So this here would be our information 500, error 500, and our warning 500 as well. And you might also have like a text disabled. Okay. And this here would be like a neutral. So for text that's disabled or on like a disabled button. Okay. There's a bunch of different ways you can set up your disableds. Really up to you how you want to structure that. But one thing that's unique here is for our text. So if we go back to the buttons that we created, so we have a surface, we have a border, but we still have just like this rogue white variable here. Okay. Now, how do we introduce a variable to represent that use case? What that is that's actually a text on action. So what this is, we're going to connect this back to our neutral, find our white. What this is essentially saying is that if the text is on an action element, what's the color? So in both these cases here, you might have a text. We might assign it to our text on action. You also have an on action hover if you want to. That's another use case where if the hover text is slightly different, it's maybe like a neutral 100. In this case, you can do that. So instead of text on action, it might be a text on action hover. Those are other text variables that we would need. Okay, so a bunch of different use cases with that. And again, the video where you get a little more complex, we cover different use cases for this text. Okay, but these are all really the text variables that you would need. Okay, next what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at our icon variables. So now for our icon variables, what we can do is we can actually just duplicate this group called text, set this to our icon, and then just delete each of these because again, we're not going to have an icon headings, icon body, icon placeholder, icon caption. Okay. But one thing we might have is actually an icon that's sort of just like a default icon that if it is actually floating in like some text somewhere, okay, it's an icon like a top nav, it doesn't have any color associated with it. What we call that is an icon default. Okay. You can also call it an icon primary, but just because we already have a primary like color in our alias collection, sometimes people say it gets a little confusing. Okay. Now, in terms of your text and icons, they really are the exact same. Okay. Because you want some consistency between the text and the icons for the specific pairing. Like you don't want your success icon to be a completely different shade of success of green than your text success. The chances are they're going to go together. Okay. They can be different, but it's best to keep them a little bit more consistent. Okay. Really that easy. Okay. So now we have our surface, border, text, and icons. Now, one thing that we notice here is we notice that like this setup here can cover about like 85% of use cases. In the other video, it goes into more complex ones where it covers like the remaining 15%. Okay. So there really is no need here for component specific tokens, like, button surface, button border, button text, button icon. Okay. We're basically able to cover most general use cases with just like these standard groupings in this really simple, basic setup. Now, what I want to do here is just show you how easy it is to build a light and dark mode. Okay. All you really need to do is just simply inverse the colors. Set your white to a black, set your neutral 100 to an 800. 500 is kind of in the middle point, so we can set that's like a 400. This here can be maybe like a what is this, like a 300. Okay, now one thing, whenever we have like our base primary color, we might actually want to keep that the same. So whenever we see primary 500, just to maintain consistency in that core brand color, okay, across light and dark. But everything else, we're really just inversing. Okay, so this here might be an 800, 800, warning 800, information 800, disabled, where is it here, or neutral 700. And again, you still need to go through and like do your accessibility testing. Whenever I'm building out a dark mode, this is generally where I start. Okay, I just simply go through super quickly, inverse everything, and then test everything a little bit later on. Okay, it really is that simple at the end of the day. 700, 600. I might messed up here somewhere, but anyways, forgive me for that. This here might be, maybe just a white. Set this to maybe the 100, neutral 600, 400, black, on action hover, our 800, our 400, our 400. We'll keep this. We'll change that. Sorry, our 400. 400, 400, and then our 400, or sorry, maybe our 300, whatever works. Again, I'm just going quickly here just to show you. 300, we'll keep that the same. This will be our black. This here might be our 800. Anyway, if I made any mistakes here, forgive me. I'm just going quick just to show you really quickly how easy it is. Our 400, our 400, our 400, and then our 300. Okay, so really just inversing all the variables. It's basically what we're doing. So then if we have this fill here and we set this to like a surface page, sure, for now. And then if we were to swap the modes here from it's currently at our light, and then if we go to our dark, notice now how we have like the dark mode variables. Okay, so in terms of your light mode, dark mode, everyone thinks it's super complex, that you need like some really complex structure. It really is just as simple as like inversing your variables and then doing your accessibility testing. You're also going to recall here that, so we have our light and our dark. Then what we also did is we actually, if you recall back, we introduced like a primary change in primary color in our alias for brand A and brand B. So now what we can actually do here is add a different mode, a second mode. So we already have the map to light mode, dark mode applied, and then still the same way that we would apply the mode before. What we can do is inside our alias, we can actually assign this brand A, and now we can swap between brand B, light, and also dark mode. Okay, so really is that simple. You're gonna notice when I swap between brand A and brand B, the colors change itself. Okay, and just the reason why the surface colors did not change there. It's just because I only changed like the color of the backgrounds, because I only changed like the one primary color. Okay, so again, if I swap between brand A and brand B, notice how those colors adjust accordingly depending on the brand. Okay, so that's the real purpose why we have the alias. Keeps things organized. You swap between your brands and your alias, then your light and dark in your maps. Okay, so that really covers like our color variables out of the way. But now what we need to look at are things like our type variables, like where do we hold our fonts, our font weights, how do we apply those, things like our border widths, our border radiuses. Okay, so we already looked at our colors, but now where do we integrate like our string variables and our number variables in the context of a design system? Okay, so the way we do that is we actually go back to like our brand collection, and with our brand collection, there's a couple things that you can do with this. Is again, there's a bunch of different ways you can set things up. But what you can actually do is apply a string variable and just have like font style, where you can really just set this to maybe like a primary or whatever. Again, a bunch of ways you can set it up, and set this maybe to something like enter, so the specific name of a font, and then like a secondary if you wanted to. You can also just call this like enter and Roboto if you want, or Roboto. Again, it really depends, like if it needs to change between brands, okay? But for most of the time, the font generally doesn't, at least in a lot of cases that we work with, if you're working just a simple design system. So we just tend to keep it here within your brand collection. So then if we were to apply this, okay, so set this to something like, hello, what we can actually do is inside our fonts, sorry, I got too many modals happening here. We can actually just apply the variable here. So we can apply the inter variable, and it's going to apply the inter fonts. Or what we can do is actually just apply the, this should be capital. There we go. We can apply the inter variable. There we go. So we can see that that font inter is then applied. Or what we can do is we can apply the Roboto variable, and that font is actually going to swap to Roboto. So hopefully if I zoom in here, you can see the difference as to how those change, okay? You can also introduce a new grouping that you call font weight, okay? And this is where you might have like bold, bold, semi-bold, and then semi-bold here. Okay, so then we can go into our font weight. And again, the name of the value needs to match what's here. So one thing that's important to note is that sometimes fonts, they don't have a semi-bold. So if you try to apply a semi-bold variable to a font that doesn't have a semi-bold, it's not going to work. So you might need to structure it a little bit differently. Like you might need to break out inter and Roboto into different groupings, okay? So that way, like the naming for their font weights they're not connected, okay? So, but we know that inter has a bold, so I can go down here and apply like the font weight of bold, and then I can see that that's set to bold, and I was set it to semi-bold. Notice how that font weight changes, okay? So setting up your font style and font weight, you do it actually using your string variables inside of your brand collection. You can bring these into your alias collection if they need to change between brands, but just for the purposes of the simplicity for this exercise, we're going to leave them in the brand collection for now. So in other videos, what you probably seen me do is actually build out a scale in the brand, okay? But we're going to skip that for now because this is more of an introductory video. You might see me build out a scale inside the brand collection in other videos, but we're going to just ignore that for the purpose of this exercise, okay? But generally what we do then is inside our alias is we actually introduce a number variable, okay, for like our border grouping, for our border radius. And then it can be like a small border radius, small, medium, large, that kind of thing, where it might be for a border radius, it might be a 2, you might have a 4, and then you might have an 8, okay? So same for brand A, brand B, brand A and brand B, and then you might have an 8. You can also introduce an extra large, extra small. You can also introduce like a none value. So if not, like one of your components does not have a radius, and then also just skip to something like a round where you just set this like 1,000. That's always going to keep whatever is applied to it like nice and round. So think like a pill-shaped button, okay? Now the reason why we bring border radius and border width into our alias, because it might change between brands. That's really the reason why we do that. And again, if our font weight and font style would also change between brands, we can bring that in here. So we can also duplicate this and have a border width, border width. So with your border width, the same thing might apply, okay? So you might have a none, 2, 4, 8, and again, there wouldn't really be a case for like something like 1,000. You can kind of just keep it at that, okay? So in terms of setting up your design system for your border radius and border width number variables, this is where those would go into. So one thing we looked at a little bit earlier on was the idea of like using modes to build responsive designs, okay? So, and if we want to do that, what we do is we actually introduce a new collection that we call a responsive collection. So inside of your responsive collection is actually where you house all of the variables associated with your type, okay? Your type, any specific spacing requirements, things like that. Now, the best way to look at this and best way to start is have a size for like frame width, okay? Or device size. Okay, so you might have a desktop here, which is again a 1440, and then you can add another mode actually for your mobile sizing, and you can add a mode for your tablet as well. Okay, maybe this is like 440. Okay, so again, then what you would do is if you were actually on like building out like responsive designs, let's see here, let's go into our width, let's apply that where's our device size 440, and then extend this out a little bit, and then what you can do is then you can toggle the mode on your responsive collection to be mobile, okay? But it doesn't just stop at that, okay? Is you can actually even break it out in between things like your H1 and your H2s. So add in a number variable for like an H1. You might have a font size. And here you would also add in like a line height, and then also even paragraph spacing across desktop, mobile, or tablet for your H1s. And then I would duplicate this, and it would have an H2. I could duplicate this, then also have an H3. I could duplicate this. I'll also then have an H4. Duplicate this, have an H5. H5, however many H tags that we have. And then this here would be an H6. Okay, so I would define what the variables are for my font size, line height, and paragraph space across all my H tags across desktop and mobile. Okay, assuming there's some differentiation between them. You would even go one step further then is actually duplicate this and have for like your paragraph large, your basic paragraph size, which generally tends to be or basic paragraph size, sorry, which tends to be 16. And you can even have like a paragraph small, or also then even get into like a caption. Okay, so duplicate this for something like a caption size. Okay, and what this allows us to do, what this setup allows us to do inside of our variables is have a lot of control over the specific sizes across desktop and mobile. Now, if you look at some of our other tutorials, what we do is we actually go a little bit more in depth as to like how to build out these scales a little bit more. But again, it's just an easy way to look at things in terms of this tutorial. So again, inside your responsive collection is where you would house H1, H2, H3, H4, H5 for your font size, line height, paragraph spacing, also for your paragraph spacing as well for your text. And then of course at the specific device size level. So again, I could toggle between desktop and mobile, and all the font sizes, line heights, everything else would simply adjust accordingly. Now there is also the concept here of like jumper variables where, sorry, let me delete two of these here, where you might go from like a really small spacing to like a large spacing, a large spacing to a small spacing. What this is a little bit too complex for this type of tutorial. And it's pretty rare for, again, you might have seen this in some of our other videos, and it's pretty rare to really build out jumper variables when you're just getting started with the variables. Usually jumper variables are only built out once you have an entire design system, all of your designs already built out. Okay. And even now, what I'm tend to seeing is like it's pretty rare for designers actually to introduce your jumper variables, because if you actually structure your auto layout correctly here. So let's maybe just add in just like this frame here inside of this other frame. And we're going to set this one just like a dark so you can see it. And let's add some auto layout. Okay. Maybe we want the padding to be something like 16. And I can see we're on desktop right now. And what this is actually set to fill. So then if I wanted to set this to mobile, the variable wasn't applied. Apply the variable to our device size. There we go. So I can see we're on mobile, and notice how the card condenses with it. And if I swap to desktop, notice how that stays the same. Okay. Generally, because like design can be responsive in Figma now, we tend not to really use jumper variables as often as we used to. Okay. It's just the flat out truth. It's pretty rare that I do see design integrated. But what jumper variables are really for, okay, just as an example, is in this case, let's say, what was the padding that we had set here? The padding that we had set was 16. So in this case, what we might want to do is you might want to define like a scale where it's, we maybe our extra small is set to 16. Our extra small is set to 16, but maybe our large is set to something like a 36. Okay. So on desktop, this would then be a 36, but then our extra small would therefore be a 16. So the jumper variable is basically saying that we're going to go from this basic sizing to this basic sizing when we adjust device sizes. So if I was to apply the variable here for our large to extra small, look what happens then. Is at desktop, we go from 36, but then we swap to mobile, we actually go to 16. Okay. So it's more used now for things like padding and gap than any type of like width more often than not, because this allows us to control what the appearance is or just around, gives us more spacing, reduces spacing depending on device size. So that's the rough concept of jumper variables. Again, I have other videos where we go a little bit more in depth to that. Check out our responsive design video and also some of our other videos associated with design system setup. We get into that a little bit more. Okay, so that just covers jumper variables and building responsive designs sort of at a high level, again, by introducing this idea of a responsive collection. Now, there's one other thing that I'd like to cover here is if we just have this rectangle, I go to apply a variable. Notice how I have all the different variables for me to choose from. So it actually needs to search for something like a surface, right? But what you can actually do is you can color scope your variables or scope your variables entirely to really only select where they're actually shown. So if I don't want to show these variables in our brand anywhere, what I can actually do, again, 2-finger tap on your trackpad, I'm on a Mac, hit edit variables, and select where you want them to be shown, okay? So even for our color variables, also for our string variables as well. So it almost hides them from selection. So if we go into our alias here, just within our colors, we can edit these variables because again, we're going to be applying variables from our mapped collection. And then these here, if I only want to edit these so that they only show in radiuses, I can select to only show these within our radius. Within these, I can select to only show these for our widths. For our strokes. And then if we were to go into our mapped collections, again, if I was to select some of these as an example, I'll show you what I mean, is it doesn't give you specifics to only allow them to select to apply to an icon as an example. But it could apply to basic like shapes, frames, text, so on and so forth. But once you scope everything else, your mapped collection tends to be relatively straightforward. Okay. But again, the idea of color scoping just allows us to what's the word I'm looking for? Enhance our workflow a little bit. Whereas if I wanted to apply a radius, notice here now I only have the radius to choose from just because we haven't scoped like our responsive collection yet. So we don't see border widths or any of the other variables here that we had within our brand or map or alias collection, just the radius because we scoped it to only show for the radius. And if I was to scope a responsive collection, these would not show up, okay? So color scoping or scoping your variables is a really great way to stay organized and improve your workflow and wherever you're working with your variables. If you want to watch the video, it's taking the world by storm, click right there. And if you want to watch a video I highly recommend, click right there.